So welcome everyone here in the Schönfeld Lecture Hall, as well as out there in your homes streaming in. And we are very happy that you found your way to join us today for this inaugural Frontiers of Science lecture, which allowed us to bring to Dresden Professor Vegard Skirbekk from the National Public Health Institute in Oslo. And as you know, he will be speaking to us on understanding the global transition to low fertility. But before we get there, I think let me tell you a little bit about this format. Why in the world another format yet? We felt in the rectorate, and in particular Vice Rector for Research, Angela Rosenwolf, and myself, that it would be very fitting for an excellence university to have such a lecture format that pushes the boundaries of science across the multiple disciplines that we host on our campus, and bring in lighthouses for new thought, provocative thought that pushes the limits of what we know. And we really pursue three goals with this lecture series. And the first is to learn about these pushers and learn about their questions, learn about their methods, learn about how they got to be pushers of the frontiers. And secondly, we also would like to use this format to maybe get into a little bit of reflecting about how we do science, how research develops, what are the constraints, what are the facilitators, and by listening to speakers from different fields, we may be able to recognize similarities and differences across disciplines when it comes to pushing frontiers of knowledge. And of course, as you know, we are very concerned as a university on what happens in society and how we can make a contribution. And so, of course, we are also in this series interested in whether maybe there are social triggers that push frontiers of science, or whether there are economic changes, whether there are political and economic constraints that push science or undermine the pushing of science. So we also like to see this positioned not in an ivory tower, but in a societal context. And of course, not each and every lecture will satisfy all three goals to the same degree. I'm just placing these three seeds with you, and then maybe you can take them along whenever you return to listen here or online to one of our lectures. In principle, we are planning to have one of these lectures per semester. They need to be special, they remain to be special, we bring in special people, and we hope to attract a special audience. And so it will be always on the first Thursday in December, so you can mark your calendar for 23. And then we have selected, remind me, Angela, 1 week in June. Well, while she's looking, the last Thursday in June. So it's the last Thursday in June. So to challenge your memory a little bit, the first Thursday in December and the last Thursday in June, always here. And I think eventually everyone will get to know how to enter this lecture hall and not get lost in the endless hallways of Barkhausen. Anyway. So that's about the format, and we are as we are selecting speakers, we focus also on the grand challenges of our planet. And so we believe that with Vegard Skirbekk we brought someone who exemplifies a pusher of these boundaries when it comes to this big challenge of demographic change. And In June, I can already give you a preview. We will focus on the climate crisis as another grand challenge of the 21st century. So now a little bit about Professor Vegard Skirbekk, who is with us tonight. He is a population economist and a behavioral demographer, and he is working at the heart of data-intensive sciences. So I'd say in all of these respects, he fits very well with what we are trying on this campus in one or the other respect. His main research is characterized by a deep conviction that multiple disciplines need to be brought together to develop answers for these pressing issues of our times, in particular to decipher demographic change. And he would like to shed more light on determinants of health, determinants of productivity, as they develop across the life course. And of course, these drivers, these determinants, change according to historical circumstances. May they in the labor market, may they be in the labor market, may they be based in technological and cultural change. Professor Skirbekk received his diploma in economics from Oslo University. He then moved on to continental Europe. First, he had a stopover in the World Economic Institute. Tell me again, what is the right title in Kiel? Institute for World Economics. And then he landed in a very soft spot for demographers, the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research in Rostock, and also, of course, being affiliated with the University of Rostock, from where he got his PhD. So that's where he did his PhD work, in this very unique environment for innovative demography in the 2000s, led by Jim Bopel and a number of other really great thinkers in demography. From there, he moved on to another very exciting place. It's called IASA, and some of you may know it. It's spelled out. It's the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Luxembourg, not to be confused with Luxembourg. Luxembourg is close to Vienna, and this Center for Applied Systems Analysis is another hotspot in some of its tracks for forefront demographic research, and a very international community there. In 2009, Vegard was awarded ERC starting grant, which he carried out there at IASA, and amongst other reasons, I'm sure this was also linked with this starting grant, that his home country felt that they needed his brain back in Norway, and so he called him to become a senior scientist at the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, which is based in Oslo. But also he became a professor of family and population health at Columbia University. At Oslo, he started a very unique center and received a 10-year grant of federal funding to get it started, really revolving around fertility, demographic change, which is one of the pressing issues he will tell us about tonight. Needless to say that he has been leaving a footprint in top academic journals such as Nature Science, PNAS, or The Lancet, and he has published a number of books, the latest of which has a very provocative title, not more, not less than Decline and Prosper. So our economists got very much thinking about that title. So, given the topics of aging, health, and labor markets in a global perspective, it comes as no surprise that Vegard's research has received a lot of public interest. In particular, his latest book got featured by the BBC, the New York Times, The Economist, and a recent interview with The Guardian. So, Vegard, we are extremely delighted to have you here this evening to talk about understanding the global transition to low fertility. Before you do so, however, I'm handing over to my dear colleague Angela Rosenhoff, and she will tell us a little bit more in depth about your work. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Ursula. And a warm welcome from me to everybody who is here. And as our rector has stressed, with Frontiers of Science, we want to address current developments within the field of international cutting-edge research and convey them to a broad, multidisciplinary audience. We also want to reflect on the trends and on the long-term processes that are driving and transforming science policy, as well as everyday researchers' practices. As you are all probably aware, over the last 10 years, our university has itself been transforming extremely. First, under the auspices of the so-called Excellence Initiative, in which 2 clusters of excellence and a research training group were funded at TU Dresden by the German Research Foundation. Then, in the Excellence Strategy, which not only saw the addition of 3 further clusters of excellence, but also the appointment of TU Dresden as a University of Excellence, a title that is held since 2012. Not least because of this funding, TU Dresden has developed into an institution that does not shy away, but thrives on tackling the big questions, especially when it comes to problems and challenges where multiple scientific disciplines overlap. And so, it comes to no surprise that the relationship between demographic changes, cultural and technological transformation, and the accompanying economic pressures has been taken by the researchers of the TU Dresden. In the remaining few minutes, I would like to give you a couple of brief glimpses into this research here at TU Dresden and address some of the challenges that accompany it. One important institution within which researchers of TU Dresden addresses the questions I just sketched on our Center for Democracy and Diversity, the CDD, which was established in June 2016. The CDD researchers have, for example, investigated the effects of migration and demographic change and have developed approaches and instruments for an effective diversity management within institutions. 2 of the leading figures of the CDD, economist Alexander Chemnitz, who is in the audience, and Marcel Thum, have been working closely on the interrelationship between demographics and labor market policy. They have also collaborated on the publication titled Gender Power, Fertility and Family Policy. That was published in the Scandinavian Journal of Economics, how fitting in the light of our guest of this evening. Understanding the multivariate factors that shape fertility decisions among partners is an important strand of research linking Thum's and Chemnitz's research scientific output. What they have drawn attention to is that the agreement on long-lasting decisions like having children relies on the commitment on how the financial costs and also the social costs of childbearing are distributed. It is alarming, but perhaps not surprising, that this problem is most acute when women see themselves forced to reduce their labor market participation when children are born. This, however, is not only a political problem, but also a socio-economic one. Lower female earnings, after all, can give rise to an imbalance in family decisions as they change the bargain power between partners. And so, to state the obvious, once you get into this field of research, you immediately realize the necessity of scientific approach that cuts across the disciplines of economics, demographics, and political, as well as social science, and links them together, which is more than interdisciplinary. For Vegard Skirbekk, who I would like to warmly welcome again as our guest speaker, such interdisciplinary approaches have served an elemental feature of his research over the last 15 years. And I had already had the opportunity to ask some questions to him in the afternoon, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. I'm excited to listen to your talk, and so without further ado, Vegard, the floor is yours.
So thank you so much, and thank you for, I'm always delighted not only to come here and to meet old friends and make new ones, but I'm also delighted that somebody is able to pronounce my surname correctly, which both of you did, so thank you for that. So not always the case. So I would very much like to thank the kind introduction that has been made and all the support and collaboration I had with Professor Stalling in over many years now, especially. So thank you, and thank you for coming tonight. I would like to, before I start off, I would like to give a little bit of background. So this is basically a presentation which is much broader than any other presentation I've ever given on fertility. It tries to, it summarizes most of what I'm presenting is summarized in the book mentioned, Decline and Prosper. And it's basically a discussion of why we have seen this development. So if you go back to the 1950s, 60s, up until the early 70s, global fertility was more than twice as high as it was today, with fertility being around 5 children per woman. And now it has dropped to below 2.4 globally, more than halving in the course of a few decades. And the question I'm addressing today is why? Why are we having fewer children? How did we end up in this situation where fertility is falling? It's falling all over the world, and it's, well, in most parts of the world, and it is, tends to when it's stabilized, or it tends to stabilize at relatively low levels. And this is unlike what many demographers thought in the past, where people saw the transition to low fertility as a temporary phenomenon, which would be followed by an increase in fertility again towards replacement levels. This has not been the case in many countries. And it's also not a Western phenomenon. It first happened in Western countries, the decline in fertility to low levels. It's increasingly also a phenomenon, for example, taking place in East Asia, which now tends, many East Asian countries, including China, has lower fertility than what is observed in the West. And more recently, we also seen strong declines in what is now becoming the most populous country on the planet, namely India. So this figure shows fertility rates by states in India, and as you can see, most states have below 2 children per woman. There are some states which have had low fertility for fairly long periods of time, such as Kerala in the south. But what's new is that the low fertility has spread to more and more regions, including J&K, Jammu and Kashmir in the north, Goa, Maharashtra, some of the most populous states, and the tendency is still that there's a further decrease in fertility, which is very important on a global scale because fertility in absolute numbers is so high in India, constituting a large share of the world's 133 or so million births per year. to understand why fertility has declined, I believe it's important to go beyond one's own discipline, and so almost all research being conducted in the field of fertility research tend to be conducted discipline-specific by experts in reproductive sciences, in health, experts in assisted reproductive technology or genetics, who tend to focus on a few issues, or experts in demography, in social sciences, in education, in policies, institutions. And the challenge is that most do not speak well to each other, or they don't appreciate each other's models and insights sufficiently. And it's important to try to be broad to understand why did fertility decline, and how did we end up seeing this strong and sustained decreases in fertility. So just mention that fertility globally changed from 5 to less than 2.5, more than a halving. There's also been a halving in fertility in richer countries such as the Scandinavian countries, where, say, Norway in the blue line had a fertility around 3 in the close to 1970. It's changed to a level around 1.5 today, also halving. But it's important to note that back in around 1970, the fertility in countries such as Norway or other European countries tended to be around, in many cases, around 3, and that was around 2 children below the global average. And now, as fertility has halved both globally and in European countries, fertility is now maybe 0.9, 0.8 children below the world average in countries such as Norway or Germany. And that means that in absolute numbers, fertility is relatively less low compared to what the case used to be in the 1970s. And fertility has not only dropped, we also seen a strong change in the timing of fertility. Women are postponing childbearing. This graph shows fertility by age from 1986 until 2020. And if you go back to 1986, you find that even for Norway, there was substantial levels of teenage fertility. For ages 15 to 19, it was considerable. That has declined strongly. There's also been a strong shift in fertility in the 20s, where fertility, for example, if you go back to the 1970s or early 80s, you found that it was very common to start, the majority had their children, or at least started having children in the 20s. And now, average ages at first birth in Norway for women has surpassed the age of 30. For men, it's 2 to 3 years above that again. So we are having children at a much later age than what used to be the case. And actually, at older ages, there's actually been a slight increase in fertility compared to what the case was back in the 80s. But this does not compensate for the much stronger decline that happened in the teens and 20s in particular. This implies that the percentage of live births to mothers aged 35 and above in Norway has increased from a level below 14% in 1999 to a level above 22% in 2019. And is this postponement of childbearing wanted? Well, it's a hard question to answer, because people might want many of the reasons for having children later, including more education, including more achieving other life aims earlier on, which might imply a later onset of childbearing. But if you ask directly what is the ideal or preferred age at first birth, you find that women, here shown by the orange lines, tend to prefer to have children around the age of 27, and men around the age of 28 or so. And women prefer to have the last birth around 36, 37, possibly 38, and men around 39, 40, 41. So it's not the case that there's at least cohort variation, that those who are younger would prefer to have children several years older. At least this is not what the answer, but this is what is happening. Fertility has been postponed substantially. And there's also been strong increases in the proportion who are childless. This graph shows two groups of countries, one which includes Japan, which has one of the highest levels of female childlessness in the world, with 27% of women who are childless at the age of 40. Germany is very high, 23%, followed by, for example, Finland with 20%. There's also another group of countries in Eastern Europe where you see where overall fertility is not so different, but there's a very different fertility distribution. So in these countries, such as in Estonia, Belarus, Bulgaria, or Lithuania, many women have one child and then stop, meaning that levels of childlessness tend to be not so much higher than 10%, which is a different culture of childbearing than what the case is in many Western European countries and in Japan. Increasingly, over time, there's also been a rise in the use of assisted reproduction. Here are the two main methods of assisted reproduction, and some argue that this could have an important effect on overall fertility. I think this is too early to say. Even today, it's around 4 or 5% in Norway who have only 4 or 5% who have assisted reproduction conceptions through assisted reproductive technologies. And we don't know how many of these children would have been born anyway without the use of ART. So yes, it has an effect, but still it's maybe one child per class or so who are conceived through ART, and it's not likely to change overall trends in fertility, at least at present. The gender dimension is very important. So if you study demography, you will realize that the vast majority of studies are focused on women. There's a scarcity of data and analysis of men in comparison, which is unfortunate because some of the strongest developments, for example, in terms of childbearing, have been for men, and more than, and it has increased more for men than for women. So this shows childlessness at age 40 by birth year, and you find that for men it increased from 15 to more than 30% from those born in the 1940s to those born in 1979. While for women there was also an increase, and it increased from around 10 to around 16-17%. So today childlessness is actually twice as high for men than for women in Norway. And this is a general phenomenon. It happens in many countries that there's been a stronger rise in male childlessness compared to female childlessness. This graph shows historical developments in total fertility rates and something called the two-sex net reproduction rate, which shows the number of children of both sexes surviving to mid-reproductive periods who are able to reproduce themselves. So the red line shows the number of survivors, and people typically, when discussing the past, discuss the blue line and argue that yes, we've seen a massive decrease in fertility over time. But if you look at the number of surviving children, the increase and subsequent decrease in fertility over historical periods has been much less pronounced. Whereas in the late 18th century, one had on average around 2 surviving children. This was again experienced in the late 20th century. And today, when you have childbearing in many of these countries around 1.5, it means not that net fertility has declined or in half. It means that net fertility has decreased by maybe 25% or so. And this puts the European countries apart. So if you look at all the parts of the world where you had look at historical trends, say look at Kuwait, you find that at its highest level, Kuwait is the country which had the highest level of net number of children ever in history. In the 1960s, they had 6.8 surviving children, and in most European countries, you never had more than 3. Which means that there is the level of population growth was much greater for these countries than what has historically been the case for Europe. And it also means that the decline in fertility has been stronger, and the subsequent changes in age structures, the has in several cases been much more pronounced. Aging has gone quicker. And this is the case, for example, for China as well, among major countries. While European countries tended to have much, much lower net fertility, seldom rising to levels above 3 children during the demographic transition. And this also implied that the European population size, also accounting for emigration to the US or North America or Australia, New Zealand, had increased by a factor of 3 to 5, while population sizes in most of the parts of the world increased by a factor of 8 to 24, in some countries even more, because of the greater net reproduction levels during the demographic transition. So what about fecundity, the biological aspects of fertility? Many have argued that this could be a key reason for why fertility is dropping, that there's changes in the biological capacity to reproduce. Some evidence suggests that natural fertility, given that women have unprotected sex during their reproductive lives, would lie at around 7 to 10 children per woman. However, there's large variation about how women have their last child in the 40s, between ages 41 and 50, and very few in populations such as certain religious groups where this is practiced remain childless, around 1 to 3%. However, there's lots of variations between individuals, and according to the Guinness Book of World Records, Valentina Vassiliev in the 18th century from Russia had 69 children. She was pregnant 27 times and gave birth to 16 pairs of twins, 7 sets of triplets, and 4 sets of quadruplets. So fertility variation is enormous. And it could also be group-level differences, where the age of menarche and the age of menopause might differ across countries and regions. Another much publicized explanation for changes in fertility over time has been changes in semen quality. This is a much cited and discussed study by Levine that argues that there's been reductions in semen quality in recent decades, and over time this might imply that we are no longer able to reproduce or less able to reproduce. However, we are still at a level where at least average semen quality levels are quite high above critical levels for whether we are able to reproduce or not. And these data are hard to compare over time, partly because some of the samples come from fertility clinics, we have a very select group, and also because there is a changes in the way the data is collected, in how they are harmonized, and to which extent they are comparable over time, implying that understanding trends is very complicated. There is evidence that fecundity is, according to some, at least some studies, increasing over time. This graph shows the age of menarche over time, and we find that this shows, again, the situation for Norway from 1860 towards modern days, and it has fallen by from around 16 to around 13 and below in this period. So the ability to reproduce biologically has likely expanded. And the average health of women of reproductive age is likely markedly better than what used to be the case in almost every country, as, for example, shown by evidence from the global burden of disease. And reproductive technologies do improve, and it might help quite a few women and couples to have children who otherwise would not be able to. However, reproduction has the social factors driving later reproduction are quite common and dominant, and might lead to a postponement of fertility to ages where fecundity tends to be lower. And social factors are likely the primary drivers of low and late fertility. Most individuals tend to still want to have children. This graph shows the proportion among 18 to 40-year-old men and women who state that they would like to be childless. Highest shares are found in the Netherlands, where around 16% of men state that they prefer not to have children. But generally, you find that in most countries, both men and women, levels below 5% are most commonly found. So very few state that they prefer not to have children. And there might be high levels of coincidental childlessness. If you look at variation by education, you find that, say in Norway, the intention to be childless is very low, at just a few percentage points, between 3 and 1 percentage point, according to education. But the share who actually ends up childless is much, much higher, 10, 12% among women. And a key reason for this development is that there's so many things one would like to do before having children. One would like to finish one's schooling, complete education, find a secure job, increasing over time, finding a career-oriented job, where you could use many years to try to establish a career and reach an adequate level of one's career development before having children. It takes time to get married. Many would like to have some money in the bank to be able to afford having children. And many prefer to buy a house and a car before forming a family, at least reproducing. Increasingly, many would like to spend at least a year traveling, playing the dating field, trying out different partners, trying to find the perfect partner online, or adjusting to the partners who are actually available. And it takes also time to move in together and try to find a partner one can live with. School levels have increased globally, and schooling is strongly related, causally related to a later onset of fertility. Longer schooling, the later one is likely to start having children. And it also takes longer to find a steady job. While school leaving ages increase, so does labor market entry ages. And people spend more and more years building careers than before. Moreover, over time, there's been a shift in peak earnings, where historical evidence suggests that peak earnings historically often occurred in the 30s. One reached one's maximum income already in the 30s, and now it's seldomly taking place before one's at least 50s or 60s. And this can be a challenge, because that means that many women and men in peak reproductive years might postpone childbearing because they would still like to advance their careers and be more likely to reach top earnings levels before, or close to, before having children. The increase in online dating could potentially have made it easier to find partners, but firms offering dating services have a disincentive for forming a stable partnership. Their business model is based on finding new partners, and it's quite hard to find a partner with the desired characteristic. 1 in 562 are the odds of a single person finding a partner with the desired traits on any given day in the UK. Evidence suggests that women are more selective than men, and according to Tinder, the man is 6.2 times more likely to like the woman than vice versa. And over time, there's also more and more factors mattering for dating and who is seen as an adequate partner, including male education, income levels, personality, and these prerequisites for what is an adequate partner can be stronger for later born cohorts. At the same time, there's still substantial numbers of both women and men who prefer the traditional family model where the man is the main breadwinner. One Norwegian survey even, where Norway has the highest labor force participation rate in the world for women, suggested that a majority, in the case of childbearing, would prefer the man to be the main breadwinner. As women's education and income increase, it might be harder to find a male mate, or it takes time to adjust to what is possible. Childlessness might differ by education. This is evidence from Taiwan, and it suggests that among women, childlessness levels are higher for women with tertiary education, while for men it's opposite. It's higher for men with primary education, suggesting that there's very different partner selection mechanisms going on. There's also been changes in partnering practices and how one establishes partnerships before having children. This graph shows the country graph on the right-hand side shows the percentage of births out of wedlock. And if you go back to 1964, you would find, with the blue line, Iceland being the highest, while by 2014, in countries such as Chile and Costa Rica, the majority of births occur outside wedlock. So there's been strong changes over time in the percent of births outside wedlock. And this is important because stable partnerships are still important predictor of fertility, and cohabitation can be related to fewer births and less marital stability, and subsequent possibly lower fertility. Number of partners have increased before having children, and one marries typically late. In Norway, it's not the case that one doesn't marry, but one tends to marry in the opposite direction than what historically was the case. Typically, one first has to have children, and then one marries. There's been an increase in the share of same-sex couples. And for lesbian couples, there's been a rise in the proportion who have children within the first 5 years of marriage. By 2008, it was close to 30%. If you go back to 2000, it was below 10%. But this has not been the case for same-sex male couples, where fertility levels tend to be very low. Another key driver of postponed and delayed and lowered fertility has been the rise in housing prices. So older people are much more likely to own housing than younger people. And over time, this is an example from Norway, there's been a tripling of real housing prices since 1995, more than that in recent years. And this means that wealth is increasingly held by individuals who are older, or probably finished with childbearing, many of them, and it's harder for young people to establish themselves because housing has become so expensive. And if you discuss, for example, fertility policies, which is typically often done, and what I've often been presenting on around the world for governments around the world, they often talk about family support measures or cash support and so forth, which offers only a tiny fraction of the increase in real housing prices. So this is much more important for overall budget constraints than most fertility policies, what they can contribute. As mentioned over time, there's a strong increase in what kind of measures or traits, individual traits that could be important for family formation. For example, personality increasingly relates to childbearing, and according to one study we did, we found that men born only after 1957, only for them neuroticism mattered. So being a man and having a neurotic personality depresses fertility. For women, there's no effect. And we also found that for both sexes, hearing impairment relates to later and lower fertility, and increasingly so among later cohorts. So hearing poorly, unfortunately, relates to lower fertility levels. We also found some bit surprising effects. We found that later cohorts are also seeing that grip strength matters more, even if it probably has zero effect for labor market outcomes. We do find that men with low grip strength, again there's no effect for women, but men with low grip strength are less likely to marry among late-born cohorts. And this was, again, not the case historically. So there's a lot to do before having children. So the list is long, and also there's commonly quite widespread misinformation about how long you can wait. Many people overestimate the likelihood of conceiving at the age of 35. This is an estimate of ovarian reserves by age, which shows drastic reductions already quite early in life, and certainly by one's early mid-30s and later. And this is often under-communicated. Another dimension which I worked quite extensively on has been religion and social values. Religion is a fundamental identity marker. It can be a basis for self-understanding, and it can affect lifestyles, diet, health, but certainly also demographic behavior. This is one assessment we did together with Pew, where we migrated the quantitative assessment, and we found that globally the red shaded countries show majority Christianity, darker shade high proportion Christian, white countries implying that there's no clear majority, green Muslim, gray secular, light brown Hindu, and orange Buddhist majority. And what we find is partly that the further away from the origins of Christianity, the more Christian the world is, and also that the secular shares of the world are decreasing. So even if in the West more and more people are going away from religion, globally there is a decline in secularism, and we estimate that because of the population growth in say, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa in particular, where there's very little signs of secularization taking place. So today, around 84% of the world population has a religious affiliation, and we estimate that it increases to 87% by 2015. Here's one proxy for religion in Norway. We looked at the age at first marriage, age at first birth by marriage type. We looked at those, looking at the men, those married in the state church on the left-hand side were on average 2 years younger than those who married in the civil hall, civil court. And we also found similar effects for women. And when it comes to number of children by the age of 40, we found, surprisingly, a very straight line for those who married in the state church, the blue line. There's no decrease in fertility. They have on average 2.2 children, and among men who married in the civil hall, they have on average 1.8 or so children. But over time, the proportion who has a secular wedding has increased massively, which relates to lower fertility. And will fertility recover? I'm often asked this question, and it's hard to answer, but I think there are many reasons to say that it's not likely to recover. Together with colleagues at YASA, we developed a theory called the Low Fertility trap hypothesis. We argue that once fertility falls below a certain level, 1.5 children per woman approximately, fertility is unlikely to recover. This relates to partly a purely accounting effect, where if there are fewer daughters born, there will be fewer women of reproductive age in the next generation. Partly a normative explanation, where if you have fewer siblings, if you grow up with fewer brothers and sisters, you're less likely to want a large family. There's substantial evidence suggesting this is the case. But also an economic dimension, that if you are worse off economically, if it takes longer to achieve the same material levels as your parents had at the time they had children, you are likely to postpone childbearing and decrease your fertility ideals. And this can have self-reinforcing mechanisms, implying that that fertility declines for every, or at least stays low for subsequent generations. Politicians frequently want to increase fertility. This is from a Danish campaign, from Speed Travels, Do It for Mom, where they argue that one should go on holiday and make babies. This is the Norwegian Prime Minister in the middle, who's argued that we should make more babies a couple of years ago in her New Year's speech. Did not have any effect on Norwegian fertility. And finally, there was also from the Danish Space Travel Agency, they had introduced a special offer, eggløsningsrabatt, which means ovulation offer. You could get cheaper travels at the time one is more likely to go pregnant. Most of these policies tend to be quite ineffective, at least in the longer term, at least so far. But there's another type of fertility policies which are likely to be more effective, and that is the opposite, antenatal policies. this shows family planning campaigns, for example, from Bangladesh or Iran, where there has been a strong decline in fertility over time. Iran has seen one of the most rapid and fertility declines ever experienced by any country, at least by major countries, where it went from close to natural fertility levels to below replacement levels in just a few years' time. Another example is from Hong Kong, which also had very high fertility and attempts to decrease fertility, which were highly successful likely, but now has extremely low fertility at levels around 1 child per woman. And there are new factors coming into play affecting at least fertility preferences among new generations. And this includes fears of conflict, of the world we live in general, climate change, resource scarcities, pollution levels, job availability. And one recent survey suggests that 4 in 10 young people fear having children due to the climate crisis. And also these new factors coming into play are likely to have a depressing effect on fertility preferences. I will advertise a little bit for the book that I mentioned, so if you're interested, I don't have any financial reasons to say this, but it is, I think, quite a broad overview of many of the causes and consequences of global fertility change, and it unlike, if I may, unlike most other books written on the topic, such as Empty Planet, written by journalists, such as Population Bomb, coming out many decades ago. I'm a demographer. I studied this field for a couple of decades, and I think I can give a more demographic expertise insight into the reasons for fertility change and some of the consequences, which many books often take extreme views, one or the other. This is good or bad, but I'm trying to argue that we should try to adapt as good as we can to what is actually happening, and we might be able to adapt quite well. If you look at the largest 10 economies in the world, all of them today have below replacement fertility. The proportion of the world's GDP that is produced in countries with below replacement fertility has increased to more than 90%. Some of these countries have had below replacement fertility for more than half a century, and they're still productive. I think, yes, there are enormous challenges associated with aging and rapid fertility decline, but still having above replacement fertility forever is not a solution. It's impossible in the very long term, and it's unlikely to be sustainable. And very importantly, aging can vary tremendously between nations. I would argue that, at least in a recent paper we did in The Lancet, we find that aging tends to vary tremendously between countries, and in countries such as Japan, you reach the same health level as a global 65-year-old in your mid-late 70s, while the same health level is reached in the mid-40s in a country such as Papua New Guinea. So there's 30+ years difference in age-specific health across countries. And this means that when one typically looks at the old age dependency ratio, which is the proportion 65+ over those aged 20 to 64, you find that, for example, Germany, Europe are relatively old countries. Japan is the oldest, high shares of old. But if you adjust for health and you take both demography and health into account, and people do not get old before they have poor health, which might happen early in some countries and later in other countries, as just shown, you find a very different rank ordering. And you do find that, for example, countries such as Sweden might be younger than Somalia, Spain is younger than India or has a lower health-adjusted dependency ratio, which means that behavior is more important, or health investments, which can be one of the key drivers of these variations in health across countries, can be more important than demographic age structure. So demography is not destiny, it's more what you do with the population that matters. So to sum up, more and more countries and world regions do see fertility enter below replacement levels. And many of the underlying factors that have caused these shifts that lead to late and low fertility are likely to go away. And this includes a later onset of adulthood norms of which age one should have children, with more and more countries seeing 30s as the age, the decade of childbearing. High housing prices, which makes it hard for many young people to establish themselves, is a spreading phenomenon. Education levels have increased and are certainly not likely to decrease in most countries. Individualization and also secularization in some countries is important and might influence overall fertility patterns. And also we have had the introduction of effective contraception with several types of new long-acting contraceptives requiring much less administration and being much more effective in preventing unplanned births. So this is also contributing to depression in especially very early fertility. And there is a lack of examples of countries reversing the trends towards low fertility. And better information among some on what happened for some among, for example, reductions in fecundity by age, or some policies, for example, certain types of housing policies may be able to reduce decline, but in some, the future is likely to be characterized by low fertility. But this is likely to be quite fine. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this interesting talk, and I'm sure that there are questions from the audience. Who wants to ask a question? So may I just start? So in Germany we had a phase, we already talked about this in the afternoon, where we had increasing fertility, and the last 2 years it went down again. So we talked about what is the possibility that the COVID crisis influences these decisions, and do you have data on this already? Because in the first lockdown, there were news that it would be a baby boom because the people had more time together. But obviously, there was an opposite development after that. What is your opinion? Would you?
Well, thank you. I think this Corona had many effects, and some have been looking into biological effects. I think the evidence we have now suggests that many of the social mechanisms might be stronger. Yes, you could have, you could spend more time together, but you could also see much more labor uncertainty. People were uncertain about the future, whether this pandemic would continue or not. Many would say that this is not the time for having children. Let's wait and see. And I also think it's most countries saw the same type of development where fertility. Many countries hoped fertility would increase, but in fact, what was actually seen was that there was a gradual depression in fertility rates following the pandemic.
Oslo, and then Shusheli. Yeah, he's running almost.
Thank you, Vegard, for the presentation and the overview. I'd like to ask a question about the modeling part of the hypotheses that you were presenting. And if you make the argument, which is very convincing, that it's a transformation, a development on a global level that has many determinants, how could we actually get together the type of data sets that would allow us across time, across nations, to model in one approach, in one big accumulated data set, all the different contributions to this piece of variance, which is called fertility decline, you know, to take into account overlapping causalities and maybe contradictory causalities and stuff like that. Is there any chance that such a kind of a data set would ever exist? I mean, I'm asking this question because I know you do know a lot about global data sets available or not available. Maybe you can speak to that.
No, thank you so much for this question. I think it's unfortunately very hard for almost all countries on the planet. There is, if you'd like to come and visit us in Norway, we are setting up this type of data. So we hope to be able to include, for example, both health, genetic, biological, social, economic, institutional information in one data set. It's a legally very hard to do it. We spent 5.5 years setting up one data set, but it's possible for some countries. And I think this is exactly what we should do more of in the years to come. And I think it's crucial to do so, because most data sets also which are supposed to be interdisciplinary are not really that. They often lack, for example, genetic information, health information, or they lack the social dimension. They tend to be one or the other. So this is the way to go.
Thank you very much for your really very comprehensive presentation about this topic. I think this is a little bit out of my field, but the current population around the world, in the world, is still rising.
Yep.
So all the data you show us from these countries, we are under replacement, but the population is still rising. So that means that actually there are actually quite a few other countries in quite different parts of the world. There are certainly another aspect. So we have a reshifting of distribution of the person population.
Mm-hmm. So may I answer?
Yes.
So the reason why population is rising today is primarily because of growth in older cohorts. So older, larger cohorts are replacing smaller cohorts that are a bit older than those again. So it's not an increase in the number of children born. It's primarily an increase driven by rising numbers of people at mid-age and older ages. That is what's driving global population growth today, not high fertility.
And I think you should also add that every headline that says we are now at 1 billion, whatever, 7 or 8 billion, they fail to say what the projections are.
Yep. And absolutely, and we just passed 8 billion last month. We will likely pass 9 billion in 2037. Whether we will pass 10 billion is still up for debate. Some people believe so, some do not. I think we should wait and see, but I think it's not going to be driven by high fertility. This is not what's driving global population growth. It is the rise of life expectancy, which is related to growth in the share of adults and older individuals, which is driving global population growth.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question. From the ecological point of view, a lower fertility must be good, right? To decrease the total number of people on Earth. I wonder whether there is, from the demographic point of view, an optimal or a good age class distribution, and how long would it take to level this out? So when we are looking now, when we have more older and less younger, then it might take a while before we are in a good age class distribution.
So, whether fertility is driving is good for the environment, fertility change in the long term, certainly yes, it has a lot to say. Global consumption levels are more important than global population numbers. However, if you would have if the world would have followed, say, the French model, where the French population simply doubled its population size during the demographic transition, we would have gone from a situation in 1804 where we hit 1 billion people to a situation where we would have been 2 billion people globally today and not approaching 10 billion. So there is a huge variation across countries, and if you would have lower population growth, that would certainly influence overall climatic and resource risks. When it comes to what age, what time we can expect to see, well, whether there's an optimal age structure, I think you're asking the wrong question. I think you should ask the question, what's the optimal range for people to be in good health and to be, have high levels of well-being? And that, as just mentioned here, it varies tremendously between countries up to 30 years in terms of when old age occurs, if you like, according to the health information. And also it will take a very long time before you can reverse a trend of aging, because it's chronological aging is can occur, but how well you age, that is the more shorter term and more interesting question in my view, because there's much to do in terms of investing in health and incentivizing healthy and long productive lives.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this interesting data and presentation. We all are convinced that this is a multivariate problem, and I wonder if you did an investigation how big the influence of each variable is, or how much it differs from continent to continent. Maybe housing is less important in one continent than in the other, and maybe survival probabilities is more here than there. This would be one question. Did you investigate the differences between countries, continents, regions? And did you also, if there is a difference, investigate, because there is more and more migration from one continent to the other, if the migrants keep their variable influence from where they come from, or if they accommodate to the variables where they go to?
Oh, this is a very good question. The answer is no, unfortunately. I haven't been able to do it because there is a lack of data globally. We can do it quite a bit for some countries, but we can't do everything, and certainly not for all countries, because the data are not existing, and certainly not existing in harmonized available data sets. And I think this is the way forward. We have to get much better data to understand these changes, but also there are some for example, education is key. There are very few countries where you have increased education levels, where large proportions complete secondary education, where you have very high fertility. It's fairly uncontroversial. There are very few countries in the world where raising education levels is seen as problematic. And it's important and when it comes to migration, I think migration on a global scale, migration of course doesn't matter. There is no migration on a global scale. Whether some migrant groups do have high fertility. There is a tendency that migrants at least gradually converge their fertility to that of the host population over time. It's still too early to say what the long-term effects will be. I think some mechanisms such as for example, in many cultures, marriage is universal, and it's unlikely that large shares will not marry among some migrant groups, but fertility within marriage is likely to decline quite strongly. And so it's basically too early to say what the long-term effects will be. But factors such as, I think the religion, traditionalism aspect is likely to play a role in the future. But how strong is difficult to know.
May I ask another question? One of the most effective ways of contraception is taking hormones, and they are also, you find the hormones in all the waters, the rivers, and so on. So the amount of hormones that are not degraded increases with potentials. The more people, the more women they take. So is this correlated to the decline of the sperm quality? And what is if you extrapolate this, what would it mean if billions of women take hormonal contraception?
So this is one of the, in the media, this is one of the most, thank you for allowing me to discuss this. It's one of the most commonly discussed reasons for why fertility declines, the decrease in fecundity, potentially, that there are, for example, that sex hormones can influence male fecundity, semen quality. I don't think we really we know enough about it. The evidence is not, in my view, not convincing so far. I think it might, but we're certainly not there yet, and we don't know whether it will have a population-level impact. So this is something, there are many animal models where this has been discussed and where evidence can be more, but whether it affects human populations is far less certain. And also and gathering these types of data is something that should certainly be done when conducting fertility analysis, because this is also something that's very commonly lacking. But at present, explaining contemporary fertility rates, no. The answer is this is not the reason, I believe.
So I would like to ask if you see the decrease in fertility as a period of transition which may stabilize at a certain low level, or if this might be an ongoing thing and lead to, like, again in 50 years to the same discussion, so it was 1.5 now and might be 0.3 at any time given. How would you see that?
I do see it as a transition to, well, it's hard to say, but my best judgment is that, yes, it's a change to where we would see fertility likely stay around the levels currently observed. So I think we have to get used to having children, having childbearing levels around 1.5 also in the long term. That is what is observed for several decades now in some countries. And yes, I think it will not continue to decrease to very low levels, at least in this part of the world.
You already talked about the psychological effect of climate change on fertility, and I would like to ask if you also see some direct or effects of climate change on fecundity or fertility. So, for example, we know that heat waves, for example, are going to worsen health in some way, and maybe there are also like some direct effects not only on health but also fertility. And I can imagine a lot of other effects of the climate change apart from heat waves that could actually affect the fertility.
Yeah, I think again, I think we're still not seeing impacts of climate change on mortality on a scale that would affect global population change. But it certainly is something that could happen on a grander scale in the years to come. Whether it affects fertility, I don't think we know yet. It could affect, it certainly affects sex ratios in certain species, but human reproduction is different. And again, this is an important dimension which will become more important, but I certainly think the psychological dimension is probably far more important than at present. People fear the future because of dangerous climate change, and this might influence reproductive choices.
Thank you, Vegard, for a very interesting talk. I was wondering about the length of your time series. I mean, if I got that right, that was roughly about 100 years, something around that. Is there any chance to get a longer time series, either by going and digging into ancient or historical data, or a specific region, or whatsoever? Is there a chance?
Yeah, well, a century is the best case in, for a few countries. We are trying to build up historical databases in going back 2 centuries. I think that would be the ideal because you would capture most of the demographic transition in many countries. But in other parts of the world, you would be glad if you can have a decade or 2, basically, because data availability is quite poor, especially historically. So that's a key issue, building up better historical data.
Thinking about state policies that influence the fertility rate, is there any data if the law on abortion has some significance or change of abortion laws? Is there a change in the fertility rate?
Oh, well, there has been historical studies, but it's hard to, if you think about the US case now with the reversal of abortion laws, we are in a very different situation than what we were historically. People are able to travel more, they're more informed. it might affect sexual behavior, it might affect how careful one is using contraception. So it's hard to say whether it will have strong effects on overall fertility levels. I think for some there will be more unwanted, unplanned births, but whether it will probably matter less, I think, than what has historically been the case, because people are able to travel to other places and have abortions. But it's quite early to say, so this is something that certainly will be studied by demographers in the time ahead.
I have a question, and I'd like to hear your opinion about social freezing. Could that have an impact on, at least, I think it was this 10-15% in your slide in the beginning, on women who basically too old to have children or to decide too late in their lives to become pregnant?
I think after I got to know more about the effectiveness of I think it's very dangerous to rely on social freezing, because such a high proportion are ineffective. There will not be successful conceptions, but I think it might have the opposite effect, actually, for many, because many are, even highly educated women might be poorly informed about low success rates of social freezing. Some see it as a progressive policy. Some firms offer this to female employees, that they can have their careers now and have children later, and do not give good information at all about success rates and likelihood of actually having children and all the complications that it might relate to, including the health of children born through the use of using frozen embryos. So I think one should be very careful about relying on these types of interventions, because they might be far less effective than what one could get the impression of them to be.
If I can, I would like to turn our attention a little bit to the second part of your book's title, which is The Prosper. And you've given us data, historical data that show that the countries that were the forerunners on this third, I believe, demographic transition to lower fertility were the winners. So they are the highly productive, and of course it could be a circular causality. I'm not implying one causal direction here. Now, that of course is of the past, and the interesting question I ask myself is, yes, you can reap a harvest of lower fertility given a certain age structure up to a given point, and where is the turning point, and then how else would a society need to change in order to continue to reap a harvest of lower fertility? Or could it be the case that actually societies, democracies in particular, will not be able to make the adjustments that are necessary in order to continue to reap a harvest of low fertility? You were primarily addressing health, and that of course is important, but we all know this is only one facet, and we do know that a society of long lives and few births would need to do much, much more. It would need to change its educational system, its view on work across the life course and how it is constructed. And that's only the three big ones, and there are many smaller things that need to be adapted. So it's humongous, it's Herculean. And so I'm asking myself whether it could be the case that if once we enter into a true experience of a rectangular age distribution, and knowing that there's no likelihood that this is going to change anytime soon, that there will be a collective intelligence or a collective behavioral adaptation take place, because societies will not be able to adapt in time, and that might turn around. I mean, it's speculative, of course, but I'm really fascinated by this global, collective, behavioral change. And it seems like the lemmings, in a way, you know? It's true. It's the exposure to a certain cultural constellation produces this type of fertility behavior. And then for me, it's really like, if that is the case, then this could also, so what could be the constellation, or is it not true? I don't know. You know where I'm getting at?
Yeah. No, I think so, and I think this is an excellent point. I think it's what you're saying is probably less speculative than the more optimistic approach that we will address in time. So we would need unprecedented changes to our institutions, to schooling for sure, but also retirement expectations and outlook on what aging should be about. And as we worked a lot on, and I think that the whole making these changes are incredibly sensitive. It's difficult, very difficult politically. It can certainly make you lose an election, attempting certain types of increases in retirement ages, for example. So it's very hard, and you do have to try to find consensus across political parties, for example, to be able to effectively introduce such policies. And I think the whole concept of changing one's mindset, I think this type of presentation I gave today, we have to try to understand that this is many more should be given very much broader focus also on aging issues, on whether we actually can prosper or not. Many nations certainly will not. They might try too late, but others might. And one should be discuss the options, and not to live in some bubble where one thinks fertility is going to rise to high levels again, because it's far less likely for most nations that this will occur.
Also, along the similar line of the discussion, I'm definitely going to buy your book and read it. So, on the one hand, we see this happening now in Germany, actually. This week, the government is discussing, trying to push new possibilities of recruiting or attracting new professional, international professional, skilled people to come to Germany on these aspects. So it's true that these countries with low fertility are still remaining quite productive in terms of GMP and all this, but the issue, how long this one can maintain. But another issue, I think, particularly on the point, is that what type of a world we would like to have globally in the future. Is this more like, you know, these high GMP, the prosper winners, so to speak, now try to attract the young people and skilled people from other countries and leaving their old people at home not to be able to be cared of. And this migration question asked by the other colleagues a while ago, so there might be some migration patterns happening. And are we going to be happy to have a world like this? Because currently the climate change is, many of the issues are produced by these very well-developed, industrialized countries, but who are paying the bill. So are we, it's difficult, it's a grand challenge. How could we try to make plans if there will be a redistribution of population? How one do it in a way that is also a harmonized world, or sooner or later we get into a situation that it's lots of unpeace around the world. I'm sorry, this is a bit too complicated, convoluted question, but I was really also wondering how one can link to other topics and then.
No, these are good points. I think when it comes to, again, I don't think really there is migration certainly will occur in the future. At which level, it's unclear. It's also important to know that one argues that one wants possibly younger migrants. In reality, all countries are aging. It's going to be hard to find these migrants over time, and also you want high-skilled migrants. And if you look at, there was a recent study which estimated the proportion of young people who have basic PISA level 1 skill scores, and it was found that 2/3 of the world's young people do not achieve PISA level 1, and in some parts of the world, especially parts of the world where you have rapid population, still relatively young chronologically aged populations, such as South America, 89% did not achieve this level. Among young people in sub-Saharan Africa, 94% does not achieve this basic level. So it's hard, even if some countries you have chronologically young age structures, if you look for those who are young and skilled, it's a very small population share. And so I think no matter what your aims would be, it's going to be hard to try to. You have to deal with an aging population, regardless of migration policies.
Yeah, I don't see any further questions. Thank you very much for the questions and for the answers. I think we, in the end, we really made the big circle for all the disciplines that we could be involved in this theme. Once again, thank you very much for your presentation and for the vivid discussions, also to the audience. And I would like to thank you again and give you an applause. And we also have a present. So thank you very much. Thank you so much. And I do not want to close before I tell you that the next lecture in this series will be on the 29th of June next year. And it will be Ottmar Edenhofer from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. And so we come back to the last questions and the questions in between, how climate change influences our lives or will influence our lives. And I hope that you will be there or here at this evening, and thank you very much again, and have a nice evening.